You think the Victorian era was all about decorum, moral uprightness, and Queen Victoria's image of strict propriety? But what if I told you that beneath that well-maintained facade, a world of brutal exploitation, debauchery, and dark secrets thrived in the hidden brothels of London and beyond? The brothels of the Victorian era weren't just places of illicit pleasure. They were organized, industrialized systems of human suffering, where thousands of women and children were trapped in the horrifying underbelly of society. These weren't isolated incidents or unfortunate stories of a few lost souls. No, this was a widespread, normalized institution that would shock even the most hardened cynics of today. What happened behind closed doors of these brothels wasn't just about prostitution, it was about control, power, and a systematic dehumanization that shaped the lives of countless women for generations. Today, we're diving into the twisted world of Victorian brothels, unraveling secrets that have been buried for over a century. This is not the sanitized, polite history they teach in schools. Prepare yourself for the disturbing reality that lurked in the shadows of the Victorian Golden Age. When most people think of Victorian London, they imagine cobblestone streets, horse-drawn carriages, and fog-shrouded gas lamps. They picture an era of refinement, etiquette, and restrained sexual conduct, where every detail of society was designed to uphold a sense of moral superiority and gentility. The vision of the time evokes images of opulent balls, elegant gowns, and a society steeped in virtue and civility. But scratch the surface, and you'll uncover a much darker reality lurking beneath that polished exterior. Hidden away in the alleys and back streets of the city were the brothels, large and small, elegant and filthy, but all governed by one terrifying truth. These were businesses not driven by choice or passion, but by exploitation and cruelty, where women's lives were ruthlessly commodified for profit. In the heart of London, districts like Whitechapel, Soho, and Covent Garden became infamous for their thriving sex trade. What's worse, this wasn't some clandestine underground network that existed only in whispers. No, it was an openly accepted part of Victorian society, operating in full view of the public eye, its presence often ignored or conveniently overlooked by those who preferred to believe in the moral high ground of the age. The brothel houses were meticulously organized, run like any other business, where the rich, the middle class, and even the upper echelons of society regularly frequented these places, indulging their desires behind closed doors while maintaining an outward appearance of respectability. These brothels weren't just for the desperate or the destitute. The so-called ladies of the night were often daughters of respectable families, women who, through a combination of social, economic, or psychological pressures, found themselves drawn into the trade. Whether through unfortunate circumstances, coercion, or manipulation, these women were left with few options and ultimately forced into a life that would strip them of their dignity and humanity. But behind the delicate lace curtains and velvet-lined parlors of these brothels was a world where women were nothing more than commodities, treated as objects to be bought and sold, used and discarded. They were forced into servitude under the strictest conditions, often enduring horrific abuse, rampant disease, and the eventual death that awaited many who were trapped in this vicious cycle. There was a methodical, almost bureaucratic approach to these brothels that makes today's sex industry seem primitive in comparison. These weren't simple acts of human desire. They were transactions in a system of exploitation that operated with cold, clinical precision. At the top of this system were the brothel keepers, men and women who ran the establishments and profited from the misery of their employees. They were the entrepreneurs of vice, organizing women into a hierarchy based on their looks, youth, and willingness to comply with whatever demands were placed upon them. These women were often referred to as fallen angels or unfortunates, terms that stripped them of their humanity and turned them into objects for male pleasure. The women who were fortunate enough to find work in the more upscale brothels were typically given a professional veneer. They were often well-dressed, well-spoken, and trained to entertain clients with a mix of sexual allure and feminine charm. But their lives were far from glamorous. These women worked under strict rules, often being controlled by men who kept them in a constant state of dependency. They were rarely free to leave or even see their families. The brothel was their world, their cage. In contrast, the women who worked in the lower-tier brothels were far less fortunate. These establishments were little more than squalid, overcrowded houses where women, often young and unprotected, were exploited for the most degrading and humiliating acts. They were often beaten, starved, and left in a constant state of fear. The conditions in these brothels were appalling. The women were often subjected to horrible living conditions: damp, dark rooms, lack of sanitation, overcrowding, and a total absence of privacy. Disease ran rampant, with venereal diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea frequently sweeping through the houses, killing countless women. Despite the supposed moral uprightness of the era, the brothels of Victorian England were not some hidden shame. They were a necessary part of the social system. In fact, many men of the time believed brothels played an essential role in keeping women out of respectable society. A kind of moral compartmentalization occurred where the brothels were both condemned and accepted, a reflection of the harsh double standards that defined Victorian gender roles. The myth of the fallen woman was woven into the cultural narrative during this time. A woman who worked in the sex trade was often viewed as immoral, a victim of her own desires. However, what most people ignored was the profound exploitation that was at the core of the brothel system. These women were not free agents choosing a lifestyle. They were often desperate, destitute, and isolated, with few other options. Many were coerced into the trade through manipulation or sheer economic necessity. But this system didn't just impact women. The Victorian brothel trade also had a profound effect on the men who frequented these places. The sexual power dynamics that flourished in these establishments were not just about physical pleasure. They were about domination, control, and humiliation. These men, from the poorest laborers to the wealthiest aristocrats, paid for the privilege of stripping away the autonomy of these women. Perhaps the most horrific aspect of the Victorian brothels was the widespread exploitation of children. Girls as young as 12 were often sold into the trade, their youth seen as a commodity that could command a higher price. Many of these children came from broken homes or were orphans, with no one to protect them. They were trafficked, bought and sold by brothel keepers, often forced to engage in acts far beyond their years. While Victorian society made efforts to hide the widespread use of children in brothels, it was an open secret among the upper class. These young girls, who should have been in school or playing in the streets, were instead subjected to horrors that would scar them for life. Many of them were raped repeatedly by multiple clients each day, with little regard for their emotional or physical well-being. The horrors these children faced were compounded by the fact that they had no legal recourse. They were property, often bought, sold, and traded like livestock. Their testimonies, if they dared speak out, were ignored, as they were considered fallen or tainted in the eyes of the law. Behind every Victorian brothel was a brothel keeper, often an unsavory figure, a ruthless individual who ran the operation with an iron fist. These men and women, some of whom had once worked as prostitutes themselves, became the managers and orchestrators of this dark underworld. They understood the value of women as commodities, objects to be bought, sold, and used for the profit they generated, and they treated them as such, with no regard for their humanity or well-being. Brothel keepers often employed a brutal mix of violence and coercion to maintain strict control over the women who worked for them. Some would physically abuse the women, beating them into submission if they failed to meet the constant demands of their clients, or if they showed any signs of resistance. This physical violence wasn't just a form of punishment. It was a tool of control, a way to ensure that the women understood their place and stayed compliant. Other brothel keepers relied on psychological tactics, breaking the women's spirits through manipulation and fear until they felt there was no escape from their miserable existence. The brothel keeper would dictate every aspect of their lives, who they saw when they worked and when they were allowed to leave, stripping them of their autonomy and reducing them to mere objects of labor. But beyond the psychological and physical control, the brothel keepers were also businessmen at their core. They managed their brothels with the same meticulous attention to detail as any corporate operation, keeping careful, detailed records of their women. These records ensured that the women were constantly working, constantly bringing in money, and constantly generating profit. They were commodities, valuable only insofar as they were able to fulfill the desires of paying customers. Brothel keepers understood that the women's bodies were their stock in trade, and they maintained control over them with a cold, calculated efficiency. They kept them in a state of constant fear, servitude, and dependency, making it nearly impossible for them to break free. In this twisted business model, the women were not seen as human beings, but as tools to be exploited for profit. The brothels of the Victorian era weren't just moral black holes, they were thriving businesses that significantly contributed to the economy. The demand for sex was high, and with it came a vast and intricate underground economy. From the brothel keepers and pimps to the men who frequented these places, the entire system functioned like a well-oiled machine, a money-making enterprise built on the backs of the women trapped within it. Brothel keepers understood the intricacies of running a business, knowing exactly how to market their establishments to attract clients. They often employed elaborate advertising strategies, whether through word of mouth, discreet signs, or subtle recommendations from those in the know. Some brothels were designed with elaborate decor, carefully crafted to offer an illusion of respectability, presenting a facade that appealed to men of all social classes. These brothels were intended to look luxurious, with fine furniture, polished floors, and soft lighting to create an atmosphere that would draw in wealthier clients. Meanwhile, other brothels were little more than makeshift spaces tucked away in squalid neighborhoods, with fewer pretensions but still running the same brutal operation. The disparity in quality only added to the complexity of the brothel economy, where the wealthier men could indulge in comfort, while the working-class clients were left to experience a much rougher, more degrading reality. These brothels created an entire underground market for various goods and services, from clothes and cosmetics, specifically tailored to make the women more appealing, to specialized furniture designed to accommodate the sexual activities expected by the clients. The brothel economy was vast, extending far beyond just the women who worked in the brothels. A whole network of individuals profited from the trade: pimps who helped supply and control the women, doctors who treated venereal diseases, and even landlords who rented out space to brothel owners. This intricate web of commerce was essential to the functioning of the industry, as every player in the system had a role to fulfill, profiting from the exploitation of the women trapped within this sordid business. The brothel system was far from an isolated network. It became a reflection of a darker side to Victorian life, a world that existed just beneath the surface of polite society. The hypocrisy of the era, which outwardly championed moral virtue and family values, was starkly at odds with the thriving trade in human misery that continued to operate in full view of a society that preferred to ignore it. The brothel economy was a necessary part of a society that relied on it, yet conveniently pushed it into the shadows, leaving its victims to suffer in silence while the rest of society turned a blind eye to the exploitation happening just around the corner. By the turn of the 20th century, the brothels of Victorian London were slowly becoming exposed for what they truly were: deeply entrenched institutions of systematic sexual exploitation, carefully disguised under a veneer of respectability. These were not mere isolated establishments, but well-organized systems that had grown to support an entire underground economy. Efforts to regulate or abolish them through legal means were met with fierce resistance, as the brothel economy was deeply ingrained in the very fabric of society, benefiting various sectors and individuals who had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. The stories of the women and children trapped in these brothels, most of whom died in poverty, disease, or despair, were largely forgotten, their voices silenced by a society that preferred to ignore the truth. These victims, who lived lives of unimaginable hardship, were left without a chance for redemption or justice. Their suffering was suppressed, and their stories were buried under layers of societal denial. Today, much of this painful history has been swept under the rug, leaving behind only remnants of their torment in the form of police records, court documents, and the occasional surviving testimony. These fragmented accounts, while invaluable, are often the only surviving traces of the lives destroyed by a system that cared nothing for their well-being. The legacy of Victorian brothels still echoes in the modern world. The institutionalization of sex work, the systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals, and the normalization of sexual violence have left scars that remain visible today. Despite significant progress in some areas, many of the same systems of control, manipulation, and exploitation persist. The horrors of the Victorian era were not isolated incidents confined to a specific time period. They were part of a much larger ongoing cycle of human suffering that continues to affect marginalized communities around the world. What we see now is the lasting impact of that dark chapter of history, proving that the damage done in the shadows of Victorian London has far-reaching consequences that are still felt in the present day. The truth about the brothels of the Victorian era is far darker than the polite history we've been taught. Behind the image of a moral society was a world built on exploitation, abuse, and the systematic dehumanization of women and children. These were not isolated incidents, but an essential part of Victorian culture, an open secret ignored by many and hidden from the masses. The history of these brothels reminds us that beneath the surface of every society, no matter how refined, lies a darker truth, one that is all too often overlooked or forgotten. Understanding this history isn't just about confronting the past, it's about ensuring we don't repeat the same mistakes, allowing history's victims to be remembered and their suffering acknowledged. As you reflect on this hidden history, ask yourself, what other dark secrets have been buried beneath the veneer of respectability? What truths are we still ignoring today? Only by facing these uncomfortable realities can we truly begin to heal and prevent the repetition of such horrors. The past is never as neat and tidy as we'd like to think. It's messy, painful, and full of truths we'd rather not face. But face them we must if we ever hope to move forward.